Good day to you. I don't know what life is like for you in the pandemic, but we probably share some things in common. We're very much housebound. Yeah, a lot of us are working. Some of us are working outside of the home, but a lot of us are working, playing, living, sleeping, doing a lot more in the household. And that requires a lot of adjustment. Like right now, I'm going to a place where I can deliver today's lecture because it's going to hopefully have a bearing on it. And I have to go through a garage that's full of my daughter's stuff. I don't mind at all. But she's home too. And a lot of us have a lot of people living with us that haven't been living with us before, or we haven't been living with them. It's part of our routine, and yet we're able to adapt, right? We're able to figure out a system for coping and surviving. It may not be easy right now, but we're able to figure that out, right? And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm moving to a spot where I can talk about our subject today because it involves a system. It involves a system as a methodological approach to studying media. And for graduate students, today will be extra helpful, I hope, because you have your first assignment coming up where you're evaluating a research article. It's due tomorrow, Friday. And you're going to have to be evaluating the methodology of the article. And that's really what we're talking about today. We're talking about a methodological approach for studying media. So we'll be getting into that shortly. And I want you to think about your system in the morning, and how the things that you are doing are related to each other. For example, if you don't get your shower, if you don't have your cup of coffee, if you're a coffee drinker, if you don't listen to the news in the morning, if you don't listen to music, whatever your system is about, it gets thrown off if any or more than one of those things gets thrown off. So I want you to be thinking about that as we go through the class today so that you can relate the material to your own personal situation. Before we get into that, though, let me talk about the RSC Post once again. Just want to make sure that everybody knows that you have all the resources you need to understand this assignment. You have only to go to the feedback that I'm leaving on D2L, or you can check your email for the emails that I'm sending around with excellent student samples. So that's the best place you can go. And then above all else, you have the assignment. It's short, but the words are very clear what you should be looking for in the RSC Post when you're analyzing the media that are either directly stated or implied by the columns. Not the ideas in the columns themselves, but the media use that's implied or stated as it is in many of the columns. So that's the RSC Post section of today. Let me move on to the Country Media Response Post. I think that most people are in sync with what this assignment is about. Remember, what you're doing is you're taking the concepts for the day that we're discussing. Today, we have readings in Elements of a Media System, and we also have this video lecture. So you're applying the concepts that come out of this, at least 3, maybe more, and you're trying to explain the piece of media content that the student has posted, the student who has been assigned for today. So that's ultimately what you're trying to do. And as always, I'm really expecting writing that gives me access to your ideas. If your writing is poor, it's not just a question of you not knowing grammar. That's another question. That's for the English department. For me, it's about getting access to your ideas and knowing what you're trying to say. All right, so before we get into our material, one more thing, and that is I want to just mention you will find all of the readings that I've posted online for you for free. All of the readings are going to be having primer questions, what I call primer questions at the start. And that's maybe a way for you to start to assess your own baseline knowledge before we get into the subject. Remember, this is a comparative media course, and that involves, I said at the very outset, trying to discover what your reference point is in life by comparing other things. And so the primer questions are designed to get you to see what you start with before you get into the material, and then you can compare yourself later. Now, let's move on to this idea of a media system, and I'll start with this. When you're an academic, as you all are, you're in college classes. Some of you are undergraduates, some of you are graduates. When you're an academic, the hallmark of being an academic is you are taking a methodological approach to studying what you're studying. You're taking a methodological approach to studying what you're studying. A methodological approach means you're going to have a method to your madness, so to speak. That you're going to have a way of studying what you're studying wherein you know that what you find out is fair, it's balanced, It has nuances. It has multiple viewpoints. That's what makes you a learned person. That's why we have a methodological approach. And generally speaking, a methodological approach consists of two things. It consists of a conceptual framework. That means a set of ideas that guides the study. And then secondly, after the conceptual framework, it consists of the variables, the things that you look at that can vary amongst situations. So just a rough example of that, a conceptual framework, to use a metaphor, is like putting a boat at sea and saying, let's go explore the sea. You would not put a boat at sea without a captain. The boat could hit rocks, it could capsize, it could hit another boat. Too many problems out there that can happen right away. So you have a captain to guide the boat, and that's what a conceptual framework does, is it guides your exploration of study in whatever you're studying, whatever your college class. The variables are the things that change. You know, if you're the captain on the boat, the things that can change are the weather can change. How hungry the crew is can change. So, all right, we don't want to go too far with that metaphor, but this is what we're doing with a methodological approach. So a system is one methodological approach. It's called a systems approach. It became very popular in the 1960s, actually. And it's basically defined by four principles, a systems methodological approach. First of all, the parts that are part of the system are mutually influenced by each other. So that if one can change the other and the other can change back the original one, so to speak. So a seagull flies across your bow as you're sailing across the sea. Okay, I'm going back to the metaphor. As you're going across the sea and you look up, and the seagull sees you look up and then flies away because it thinks maybe you're going to try and catch it. So you're affected by the seagull, you look up, the seagull is affected by you. This is what we're saying here, is that the parts mutually influence each other. Secondly, what makes a system a methodological approach is there is a wide range of resources available, a wide range of resources. To choose a different setting, behind me is an ecosystem. We even call it an ecosystem. And that is full, that ecosystem, of all kinds of beings and creatures that are living out there all through the really harsh times of winter, including squirrels. And there's a squirrel's nest up in that tree. That one over there. Wait, where'd it go? Yeah, you won't be able to see it anyhow because of the tree in front of that tree. But there's a squirrel's nest up there. And those squirrels are living all year round. And to get the wide range of resources that they need to live through Pennsylvania's really crazy climatic conditions, they have nuts buried in the ground in the winter for when there are no other nuts that are growing on trees because it's winter. And then if worse comes to worse, they're getting in my trash in the driveway. So a system has a wide range of resources. And then thirdly, a system has stability even though there are external pressures on it all the time. External forces that are sometimes hostile, trying to change that system. It could be the weather, right? I've had trees come down in this backyard because of big storms coming through in the summer and in the winter. And yet the yard still exists. New trees grow in their place. It's not the end of the backyard. So there is stability despite external resources. But despite external forces. And it is those external forces that leads to the fourth and final part of what makes a system a methodological approach. And that is, because of these external forces, there is constant change. In fact, the system needs to change because it has to adapt to its environment all of the time. If it doesn't, it withers away and dies. That's one thing that happens to older people from a natural standpoint, if you want to look at it this way, is some people reach an age where they give up the will to adapt to the constant change. It can start very early on in your early 60s when you start talking about, I don't know, these new gizmos that people are purchasing, these new cell phones. And then it just kind of escalates as a way of exiting the world. I don't mean to be too morbid here, but it's illustrating, I'm trying to anyway, that constant change is necessary for a system to live, to exist, to continue, to progress and improve. So media and mass media embody all of these four dimensions that I just mentioned. Mass media, therefore, are a system. Mass media have to adapt to all kinds of changes. There are all kinds of business changes going on. Companies purchasing companies, as we've kind of established under globalization. Companies buying out other companies. companies going out of business. I read that in this pandemic, in one of the aftermaths, is there going to be 12 very popular restaurants that will be out of business. I don't know whether it's true. I'm mentioning among them Ruby Tuesday, for example, and Panero was on that list. I was surprised to see. Can't give you the source of that. I don't recall it, but it's an example of how external forces can try and impose hostile conditions, but if a media system is going to exist and live, it has to adapt. So media systems experience external forces. Media systems draw on a wide range of resources. The Disney company that I mentioned yesterday doesn't just have theme parks to exist and to make a profit. It also owns ABC, the television and radio network. It also owns ESPN. Did you realize when you're watching ESPN, you're effectively watching Disney? And ESPN viewership is down right now, but Disney film viewership is up because of the pandemic. So resources get shifted around. And then media systems also have stability to them. They have financial stability. They can go through recessions and still exist. The networks on television, they used to command the audience in terms of numbers. ABC, NBC, CBS in the 1970s, they could capture, all three of them, 80% of TV viewing. That's three networks capturing 80% of TV viewing, which could be as high as 100 million people on a given night. And so, but times have changed. The cable, satellite, streaming, cell phones, they've eaten into or cannibalized that original TV audience. The television networks are way down. They can get 10 million people on a single night, any one of them. It's a really good night for them. And yet they thrive. They exist. They still have prestige. They still have an important place in our TV viewing landscape. So media systems, they also have stability. And of course, media systems have constant change. What is here today may be gone tomorrow. Radio stations constantly flip formats. They find that the format that they have, it's top 40 or album-oriented rock or urban, is not doing it anymore in terms of a sizable enough audience to sell to advertisers, so they change the format. Media systems undergo fundamental change. Now, let's turn to how we are specifically going to operationalize the idea of a media system as our approach, our methodological approach in this class. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be visiting one by one the elements that I decided when I wrote the book Comparing Media from Around the World that I decided would comprise a media system. And you can interpret on your own as you go through this, and I encourage you to do that. Would you have invented another element? I think that would be very interesting for you to see. When you look at a media system, what's missing? Especially since I wrote this book in 2006. Maybe social media have added something that need to be considered in terms of a brand new element of a media system. What are elements? Elements are fundamental components. They are fundamental. Without one of them, the system won't exist. They are the absolute basic building block of a system. And each one is related to the other. Each one of these fundamentals is related to each other. So I call the fundamentals in my book and in this class elements of a media system. Elements of a media system. We're going to go through one by one in this class. Each element is going to be related to the other. Some elements are going to be stronger at times than other. One of the elements we'll be looking at will be financing. In the cases of some TV content, financing has a bigger impact on TV content than does, for example, philosophies of a media system, which is another element that we'll be studying. So some elements are stronger than others at various times. Also, one element may be used to illuminate another element. You may need to look at one in order to see one of the other elements, and that's what we've already established with media content. It becomes a window, right? And we look through that window, and then we can see the other elements of the media system. Also, sometimes you can have a special relationship between two of the elements. We're going to be going through two elements that have that relationship. One is media content, another is news reporting. News reporting is a kind of media content, right? So they have a special relationship to each other. One is in and of itself a part of the other one. That's the speciality of that particular relationship. Also, all elements together make up the system. You can't just look at one or two and take one away. You can't take one away. The system collapses. They all make up the media system. And more than that, the media system as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which actually doesn't make logical sense. How can something that you add up the parts to be greater than what each individual part adds to that system. It's a mind-boggling kind of concept, but we use it all the time, right? Sports teams use it all the time. The Chicago Bulls team with Michael Jordan, it wasn't even during most of your era, but you know about that team as the super team. The basketball championship team for 5 years with a superstar who's still talked about, Michael Jordan, and who has a huge presence on media all over the world, actually. And so the whole for a system is somehow inexplicably, unexplainably greater than the sum of its parts. Now, we also want to mention, again, that the media content in our particular class and the way that we're studying comparative media has more centrality than any of the other elements that we're going to be studying. It has more centrality. It's at the core. And that is why a big part of this class, I have students posting examples of media content from their countries. We had a great one to get us off to a start yesterday from Norway, and we're going to be heading down through the class path, looking at all kinds of really interesting starting points of discussing in our minds and in the posts that we're making by looking at the centrality of content. Now, suddenly in this reading, you'll find that I introduce a concept that may seem out of place, and that is the concept of a rhetorical perspective. A rhetorical perspective, and those of you who know a little bit about rhetoric know that it involves persuasion, and we sometimes use that term in a derogatory sense. Oh, I don't want any of your rhetoric, is how we say it in a derogatory sense. But a rhetorical perspective, in its essence, is really about trying to get meaning from your interpretation in a way that safeguards fairness. You're trying to get meaning, you're trying to spread that meaning around in a classroom where we're trying to understand meaning and create meaning and share meaning, but the meaning has to be fair, right? It has to be fair. And so the way that we ensure fairness as we go through this class, and we don't say, oh, what happens in Ghana really sucks, or what happens in the United States is just horrible. That's not what we're seeking to do here. We're seeking to assess the balance of various variables that we're going to be looking at, the variables being the elements. We're going to look at these throughout the course, and we want to make sure that we're being fair. So that's what a rhetorical perspective will do. It will first of all say that any of the elements that we look at has to exist in all systems, so that it has to be fair. And all the systems of all the countries that have media, we have to say, if this is an element, it has to be in all those systems. And that's going to be the case with the elements. So like globalization, we've already been looking at one. That's a good example. It's in all countries. Also, the elements that we look at have to bring enough diverse information so that we can understand context. So that we can not just isolate an observation and it's devoid of a greater understanding that's due to knowing that there's some context and some history. For example, you cannot just look at reggae as a music form and the radio music form, reggaeton. Reggaeton is be an easier way to understand that word if you don't know the genre of music that exists in Jamaica and other Caribbean countries, Puerto Rico as well. You can't look at that and understand the globalization of that without knowing that musical form came through the slave triangle that I was talking about. The shipment of slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, they brought with them the musical beat that became the basis of reggae. And I'll tell you, what was really interesting to me was to be in Ghana and hear the flip side of that. I've been in Jamaica, I've been around the Caribbean and heard the reggae beat as it is in the Caribbean sense, but going back to Ghana and hearing that basic beat and hearing it also in Nigerian music, a neighboring country of Ghana, it's really fascinating. You cannot just mention reggae without having some context, and that's what a rhetorical perspective ensures. Also, a rhetorical perspective ensures and safeguards fairness by not focusing too narrowly on one particular observation. One TV show does not a whole network make. So if you understand that awkward language, it's actually supposed to be somewhat, I guess, poetic. It's not mine. It's that sentence start. One TV show does not a network make. What that's saying is you can watch one episode of Breaking Bad. Well, that's not a great example. You can watch one episode of New Girl on television, and you can say, oh my gosh, this is really representative of the entire TV network, or it's representative of the cable provider, or it's representative of this show. It's not. So A rhetorical perspective ensures that you don't pinpoint something too much and have it representing too much more. And finally, a rhetorical perspective looks for parity among systems. And that is, when you're comparing media in one country to a media in another country, you have to try and spend as much as you can equal time on your comparisons between both those countries. The comparison of the US can't be bigger than the comparison of Ghana. We try to do that, but we're not always successful. So that brings us then to the elements that we'll be studying. We've already given a preview of those in a previous class. Some of you have used those concepts in your first country media response post. But the elements I liken to a tree as a system, as its own microsystem. And those elements are going to consist of the underground. First of all, you don't see it that well. I mean, you can look at it, but you really have to dig to get to what's underneath that big pin oak tree, which is what you're looking at right there. And when you go underneath, you find what I consider to be cultural characteristics. Cultural characteristics, that's where we're going to be heading next. That is what makes up the culture of the country, the everyday, daily living. So we'll talk about that in terms of people's media habits the next time we meet. Then after that, also drawing on the tree to derive our elements, the next idea that we have is also underground, the next element, I should say, and that is philosophies of a media system. That is understanding how a media system gets set up in a particular country. What are the goals, the needs, the ideals of the people who live in that country, and what do they want media to do for them? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about philosophies. For both those elements, we have to go digging, right? That's why we're academics. We have to research, we have to analyze, we have to try and put different pieces together. They're not easy to put together conceptually. So those are the first two elements that we're going to get into. And then we're going to spring out of the ground to the next element of looking at media as a tree, a system that is similar to a tree. We have the trunk of the tree, and that's going to embody the regulation that takes place, the regulation that comes from government and comes from other external forces and internal forces to media organizations. So we'll be taking a look at regulation after that. Then we come to the bigger branches, like you still see behind me here, bigger branches. Those are representing the element of accessibility. The element of accessibility has to do with how easy it is to get to the system, right? Like the tall branches, tough to get to. You need a ladder. The lower branches, I can go up there on the bank and touch with my hand. And then after that, we have the smaller branches, and the smaller branches is going to be financing, and financing is the way that media are paid for. And when you look at the financing, you see what areas of content are encouraged to grow, because it takes money, not always, but it takes money to produce most media content. Then after that, we're heading into the centerpiece element, and that is content. Content represented by the leaves on the tree. Even as you look behind me here, the part that stands out to you most about the tree are the leaves, right? That's what you see first. It's the biggest part of the tree. It's the most aesthetic part of the tree most people consider anyway. And so that's content. And then after that, we're looking at news reporting as an element. And news reporting are going to be those leaves that are different. They're going to be the special leaves. They're going to be leaves that have some kind of indication that there is something else about the tree that you can get to know. They can be a different color, different sheen, different size, etc. Not too many on that tree unless we go get close up, which is another example of why we have to consider the academic enterprise to be getting closer and closer and deeper. Nevertheless, that's the next element. And then after that, we're going to go to the element of imports and exports. Like the seeds of the tree will blow away and then start up in my neighbor's yard, and they become an export. And the reverse process is true also. We're going to look at imports and exports of media from around the world, and we're going to assess whether countries are balanced in terms of what they export and what they import when it comes to foreign media. And then finally, we're going to look at the audience as an element of a media system. The people who walk by the tree, stop to observe the tree, take in the tree, communicate about the tree, gain meaning from the tree. This is where we're headed for the next several days in the class, as we all are now hopefully settled into the rhythm of the assignments. And that there is going to wrap up our class today on media as a system, as a methodological, systematic approach. Have a great day.